wondering, I'm just going to go one. Yes, so growing together with the creatures in the soil, preparing your soil, who lives in the soil. And I was just thinking that what you could do is put in the chat, I mean, some of these creatures are obviously obvious, but there are others which I don't think, if I hadn't kind of researched this, I'd have any idea who they were. So I'm kind of guessing if any that you know, you could just type into the chat. You see, they've all got numbers. And some of them obviously look like some strange creature that you probably would find quite hard to identify. But number 2, for example, would you know what number 2 is? Or I don't know, you probably recognize number 6. And number 13. Anybody got any ideas for that? And number 7, which looks like something out of Dune or some science fiction program, if you ask me.
Maybe a snail. Snail.
Yeah, we've got a snail. Number 2, anybody, anything on, oh, Angela's really up on this. 13, nematodes, very good. I'm impressed. Number 2, anybody? Maybe up.
Is that
mycorrhizal fungi? Yes. There's an, actually, I don't think there is an earwig. No, we haven't got an earwig. We should have an earwig. 12 is mycelia, yeah. 10. Anybody got any ideas on number 10? Or number centipede, yep, centipede. And then we've got a slug. Whoops. Sorry, that's not very helpful, is it? And then number 8, I'm guessing you'll know number 8. As I say, there's not that, I think photographs might be a little bit easier to identify. Number 11 and number 5. Any guesses on number 5 and number 11? Oh, blimey, Elena's, yep, you're spot on with bacteria. Woodlice is number 8, absolutely. 11 is not soil bacteria, but that's very close. I don't think I would have got the difference between them. So number 11 is a protozoa. Whereas I think bacteria are single cells, protozoa are more multi-celled, but still very small. And number 9, I'm guessing everybody knows that. That's a worm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then we've got woodlice, number 8. 7 is a tardigrade. Does anybody know anything about tardigrades? They're also known as water bears, because I don't know if you can see, but they've got these claws. Actually, why don't I just go? So there are the names of everything. 2 is a springtail. They survive in space, exactly, Angela. These poor things have been subjected to space travel, where they have existed in a vacuum and have existed, I think, in like space temperatures. You know, they've frozen them down to some ridiculous -200 plus centigrade. They've dried them out to like as much as they can. They have heated them up. I mean, they've basically tortured these poor creatures and discovered that pretty much nothing kills them. Oh. So they can lose up to 97% of their water. And if they then are rehydrated, they then come back to life. They went to space and then they were bred in space. They gave birth in space to babies that then came back to the earth. So they're incredible. They're amazing, I think, anyway. And they're, as Angela says, they're so cute. They are quite cute. Although I think if I was a bacteria or something, I'm not sure that I'd be quite so happy to see one. But yeah, they're incredible creatures. But I mean, actually, I think all the creatures are incredible in their own particular way. I mean, I have a certain respect for slugs who have like these, teeth that are basically like graters. Really, I mean, it's some huge number of teeth as well. When you look at them, magnified up, just phenomenal. And woodlice, which are actually related to crabs. so they're part of that family. They have to stay wet. You know, if they dry out, then they die. So they're not as tough as tardigrades by any means. And nematodes, apparently, if you took everything else away from the world except nematode bodies, the world would still look the same. I think it's something like that. Like there's this, there are just masses of them. They're just this huge, huge number of nematodes in the world, I guess. Woodlice are a bit grey and live under stones and wood. Yes, absolutely. Ants are obviously just phenomenally intelligent and clever and, you know, amazing social animals, if you ask me. Snails are just cute. Springtails, I don't really know much about springtails, but I'm sure they're fantastic as well. Anyway, so the point of doing this, though, is really to say, I mean, this is just a selection of creatures that are in the soil. And I think one of the amazing things is that it's all these creatures together form their own ecosystem, which is specific to the soil, but then obviously relates to the rest of the world as well, relates to the, you know, the above ground world, I guess. And it's known as the soil food web. And scientists have kind of labeled it this because there's an interconnectiveness between the plants, all the creatures in the soil, dead matter, and then of course the, you know, it goes all the way up the trophic level, so all the way up in terms of, you know, size, I guess, of creature. I mean, this diagram shows it going up to birds, but obviously that then involves all the other animals that live on Earth as well. And what's amazing is that in a teaspoon of healthy soil, there are more creatures than there are people on the planet. Okay, so just a teaspoon of healthy soil will contain more creatures than there are humans on Earth, which is, I mean, a bit mind-boggling, really. And I think what happens is, to a large extent, is that people assume that because they're small, that they can be disregarded. That's my view anyway, because you can't see them. They are very small, and so actually not much attention is paid to them, but they are absolutely crucial. And the reason for showing you this diagram is because what we're talking about today is growing together with the creatures in the soil. So these are the creatures, so it's about getting to know who they are, but it's also about getting to know the relationships between them, and in particular the reciprocal beneficial relationships that exist between all these creatures in the soil, and how we benefit from their existence and their work and the way in which they live as well. And a lot of that is to do with plants and the plants' relationship, particularly in this instance, because we're talking about a project where we're looking to be growing our own plants. And so we want to, you know, we need to understand how the plants then interrelate with these creatures. And so one of the most important ways in which the plants relate to these creatures in the soil is that we kind of imagine that if you're looking at the kind of soil that you have, that what you're considering is, do you have fertile soil or not? Does your soil have plenty of nutrients? That would be a question that you would imagine would make sense to ask, you know, especially if you're growing vegetables, which require huge amounts of nutrients relative to a lot of other plants. And it's important, I think, to understand that for most plants, for them to access the nutrients in the soil, which are usually, you know, can be extremely abundant, for them to be able to access those nutrients, they need to form a relationship with the bacteria and fungi in the soil, and in order to be able to digest the nutrients. So in fact, they rely on bacteria and fungi to feed them the nutrients in the soil. So even though, for example, there's loads of nitrogen in the air, it's not in a form that the plants can digest. And so in order to be able to digest the nitrogen from the air, they require the bacteria to actually change it into a form that they can digest, that they can eat. And so, for example, you have particular plants that form particular relationships, specific relationships with what are known as nitrogen fixing bacteria. And these are these nodules that you can see around the root. This is a broad bean plant. And these tiny little sort of nodules are actually colonies of bacteria that can convert the nitrogen in the air into a nitrogen form that the plant can eat. Okay, so, and what happens is that this is a mutually beneficial relationship. It's a reciprocal relationship where the bacteria feed the plant with that nitrogen, and the plant in turn feeds the bacteria with sugars. And so they reckon that out of, depending on the plant's age and stage of growth, between 30 to 70% of all the sugars that the plant produces through photosynthesis is fed to the bacteria and the fungi that live around the roots of these plants. So that's incredibly important, because it actually means that at times that the vast majority of the sugars that the plant's producing is actually going to feed other creatures. It's not to feed itself, it's to feed other creatures. And that's particularly the case in the early stages of growth, that will be happening. And that's both to the bacteria and the fungi that live around their roots. And that tells you two things, actually, because it's not only that therefore the plants are actually dependent on the bacteria and fungi, but that therefore having a healthy plant is going to depend on having a really healthy amount of number of bacteria and fungi that can live around the roots of the plant. So about 85% of land plants form relationships with mycorrhizal fungi. That's the mycorrhizal bit is the term that's used to describe the type of fungi that form this relationship with plants. So you also have, for example, saprophytic fungi, which live off dead material much more. Mycorrhizal fungi actually live with plants, essentially. And what they do is they actually grow into the plant roots and then create this network. I mean, they're just like a mold, so you have this kind of fungi mycelium, strands, basically, and they penetrate, they kind of grow through the soil. So where you've got the plant roots, essentially then you'll have this whole sort of cloud of mycelium, of these kind of hyphae, these little strands of fungi that extend into the soil beyond the plant roots. And what it means is then the plants have access through those mycelium, have access to water and dissolved nutrients from the soil. They can actually access those through the fungi. So they're able to have access to a much wider network. And so the plants themselves are able not only to use the nutrients that their fungi have kind of, sort of taken in from the soil and fed the plants, but actually that mycelium and the fungi extends into a network which goes between the plants as well. So they now understand that in a wood, for example, if you've got a forest or a wood where you've had trees that have been growing for a long time, that network extends usually throughout the entire forest. And so there's a whole communication system that takes place between the trees through that fungal mycelium network. And so here's a picture which I think is amazing. This is a close-up root of a plant, and all these hairs are fungal hyphae. So these are all the kind of mycelium of the mycorrhizal fungi actually growing out of the plant root or through the plant root. So that's essentially, it's really, they become part of the plant. I mean, there's not any separation. And not only that, but I think the other thing that this photograph's really what's really interesting about this photograph is that you can see how thick the root is compared to the mycelium hyphae. And so what it means is that the mycelium can get into much smaller cracks in the soil and much smaller air gaps and so on in the soil than the plant roots can. Okay, obviously this is magnified up massively. So here's an example of some corns growing, some corn roots. This one on the left was growing without mycorrhizal fungi, and this one was growing with mycorrhizal fungi. And you can see how much more strongly the roots have developed with the mycorrhizal fungi. You can see that actually corn, one of the things that happens with corn quite often is it's not very, you can see the roots are quite shallow, and quite often the plant grows and isn't all that stable. But look at all these shoots that the plants put out on the right-hand side, because it's actually managed, the plant itself is much healthier and the whole root system is much, much more developed. And I think this photograph's really amazing because it just shows you a kind of cloud of mycelium. So you can see the plant roots, and then beyond that, there's a whole sort of cloud of fungal hyphae. And you can see that then this plant is actually able to access both water and nutrients in a much greater degree of, much greater area of soil than it would otherwise be able to. Okay, so in other words, there's the fungal hyphae, so that's the mycorrhizal fungi, and then you've also got bacteria. Now, they're not just these bacteria which are feeding the plant with nitrogen. So nitrogen is a chemical which is, I think it constitutes, I can't remember quite what proportion of the air, something like 70%. It's a huge proportion of the air that we breathe in actually is nitrogen. And the plants fundamentally need it for chlorophyll, for the greenness in their leaves. So in order for plants to grow, it's one of the key nutrients that the plants need. And they need quite a lot of it in order to be able to grow successfully. So if they don't have enough nitrogen, they'll just, they won't grow. That's the long and the short of it. But the bacteria, these are specific bacteria, but there are loads of other bacteria. So I think they did a study in New Mexico where they took a gram of soil and discovered that they had 1 million different types of bacteria in this soil. So 1 gram of soil, they had 1 million different types of bacteria, which is just mind-boggling, really, because I mean, it's kind of similar to the teaspoon of soil idea, but it's like we have no idea. It's like there's this huge social kind of ecosystem living in the soil that really we know very little about. That's the long and the short of it. Okay, so we're not just talking about nitrogen fixing bacteria, we're talking about loads and loads of other bacteria as well. And a lot of these live on the sugars that the plant feeds them. Okay, so just to say one more thing about the plants being able to communicate with each other, which I think is really interesting, is that they've now discovered that it's not just, well, I think actually it really raises a question about our assumption about how natural relationships form, because actually I think most of us were probably brought up on a biological understanding that it's all about the survival of the fittest. That actually evolution and the whole evolutionary process and so on, and that actually if you look at the natural world, that what the natural world shows us is that it's natural for us to basically be competitive, and that actually the world is really all about survival of the fittest. And I certainly didn't learn anything at school about cooperative relationships. And I think that this is one instance where it demonstrates how absolutely crucial to, us living, but the entire natural world living, is that's fundamentally based actually on a cooperative relationship, a fundamental cooperative relationship. And what they understand now is that in a wood or a forest where you'll have trees of different species, what will happen is that mycelium network that exists underneath the trees will communicate if a particular tree is having a problem, needs a boost of nutrients. And it doesn't matter whether or not it's the same species. Other trees around will send out nutrients from their own bodies through that network of fungi to feed a tree that's having a problem. So, which I think is, quite really goes against the kind of prevalent presentation of, the tree will automatically, the assumption that you would automatically only act in favor of your children. Okay, because this doesn't happen. Actually, trees will support trees of other species. It doesn't necessarily matter. And so I think that there's obviously, it implies a whole other world that we don't really, I don't think we necessarily understand, but it's certainly, I think it's really interesting and, makes us rethink how, fundamental assumptions, I would say, about the natural world and so on, and how we relate to the natural world. So, but in relationship to us preparing our soil, I'm kind of emphasizing the importance of this, because what it means is that particularly when you're planting vegetables, usually what you will have done is dug over the soil in order to prepare the soil for planting vegetables. And you'll obviously need some space in the soil to plant your vegetable, because it needs some space. And so one of the things you can do is to add, you can inoculate your plants with mycorrhizal fungi. And so there are products that you can buy which you put around the roots, which are essentially spores for mycorrhizal fungi, which means that then the plant has those spores right at their roots and can immediately start developing that relationship with the fungi. And this is a picture of a permablitzer, actually. I'll explain what permablitzers are a bit later, but basically this is us doing a whole load of planting at a garden that I'm going to show you a bit more of in a minute. And this is a product called Ecto Whip Dip, and it actually consists of mycorrhizal fungi and plant gels. So these were being planted out in an area which gets very little water and an awful lot of sun. And so the plant gels are like a kind of water reservoir for the plant. And so the mycorrhizal fungi is kind of mixed with these plant gels. And they did do really well, actually, given they got very little watering. And you're talking about young plants. These aren't vegetables, these are perennials, but nonetheless, they did really well as a result of this, this inoculation. And so that's one thing that's certainly worth considering when you're kind of preparing your soil, but also when you're actually planting out. So having established that that's the case, really what we're talking about is having established the importance of the soil food web, particularly of the fungi and bacteria within the soil. The question is, how do we best prepare the soil to support the soil food web? And I'm going to be talking about 4 things: mulching, growing green manures. Actually, it doesn't have to be over winter. Feeding with comfrey and nettle teas. And I'll just briefly talk about a no-dig approach as well. So the first thing I want to look at is mulching. And so I've got some pictures here. I mean, you can mulch in lots of different ways, and mulch is essentially a way of covering the soil. And the benefit of mulching is that it will insulate the soil and protect the soil, and also feed the soil, feed the creatures in the soil, I should say. And so what we're doing here is we're preparing the soil. This was a permablitz at Forest Farm Peace Garden, which is out in Hainault, and it's a garden. It's about a 2-acre site, and what we were doing was a group of people were coming together for a day to transform a part of the garden into to plant what's called a forest garden, which is a kind of garden based on a kind of woodland edge pattern. And what we were doing here was preparing the soil. So this soil had a lot of couch grass in it and had not been dug over for quite some time. And so we needed to remove the couch grass in order to be able to put in other plants, otherwise the couch grass would just overtake everything. And so what we were doing was digging it over and then laying down cardboard on top as a mulch. This was done in the autumn, and you can see the cardboard's been wet. It's all really, really soaking wet when we're putting this down. So we're covering the soil with the cardboard, and then over on top of that, covering that with manure. And so manure or compost. And so that then we're basically mulching the soil for over the winter. And what we did in addition to that was to plant a green manure, which was essentially what that meant was we were putting in plants, adding plants, because remember that one of the key things for the soil food web to really thrive, they need plants, they need plant roots and plants that are going to feed them. So this was the mulch, and this is what it looked like in spring. This was come March. And so these plants that have come up here, this grass, this Hungarian Rye Grass, it's a bit patchy, and we weren't sure how well it would do because we had obviously had the cardboard. So it was kind of, it wasn't planted really thickly. But what we found when we started to prepare the soil for planting, is that we were then just taking the grass, pulling it up and just laying it down on the soil. So we didn't want to lose the benefit of this grass, which is in fact green manure. And I'm going to explain a bit more about that later. But what we found was that there were huge numbers of worms and other creatures in the soil. So the benefit of doing the mulch was that it created essentially an environment where the creatures of the soil food web could really thrive over winter and be protected from the ravages, if you like, of the winter. And so this is the area after we'd done the planting. So this was all planted up with the different plants. We actually laid down a weed suppressant because it was important that it was extremely low maintenance. And you can see that then on top of that, that will provide some insulation in and of itself. And then we've got a lot of wood chip as well, which will further insulate the soil as well. Okay, so this is one example of a kind of large area being mulched. And this is also a similar example. This is really just to point out that when you're preparing the cardboard, it's a good idea to take the sellotape off. So this is another permablitz, and people here are preparing the cardboard. This is for a community garden in Camden, Kentish Town. This is all the cardboard laid down before it's been wetted. So then we got a hose and made sure it was all thoroughly wet. The reason for doing that is because essentially this is a bit like a kind of surface compost. Okay, so this is one way of thinking about it, is that you're kind of composting on the soil in situ. And so what you're encouraging is the kind of, you're basically laying down a feast for the bacteria and fungi and all those other creatures in the soil to have a really, really good feast by laying down the cardboard. The worms just love cardboard. And so we, by wetting it, it means that then you're starting that composting process. And these were all bags of manure that were then laid on top, as you can see here. And so then by the end of the day, this was pretty much what it looked like. And going back to the garden the following year, what was really interesting was that we didn't do lots of digging, but underneath what emerged was that there were just millions of black beetles. So, and I mean, it was just like, I've never seen so many black beetles anywhere, but they'd obviously, they were the kind of visible aspect of the soil food web that were really, really obvious and really had suddenly developed, because they certainly weren't there when we did what I would call a lasagna mulch. So lasagna mulch is one where you've got different layers of mulching, essentially. So that's just to give an idea of a way in which you could, in the autumn, for example, you could prepare your soil. You could still prepare it now, actually. You could still lay down kind of a lasagna mulch and then plant through it. You know, put your plants through the lasagna mulch. So what I wanted to look at next are green manures. And a green manure is a kind of weird term, but basically is about growing plants that are going to cover and protect the soil. And one thing that you'll notice is that if you leave some soil bare, the soil will become covered very, very quickly with usually with a whole myriad of plants that you've got no idea where they've come from. And you kind of wonder, because you definitely haven't planted them. And you'll get, basically it won't take long before the soil is covered. And that is a situation which it kind of makes sense when you think that the soil food web is dependent on the plants. So of course, the natural tendency is for the ground to be covered. And obviously there are plenty of seeds around for that to happen. So the idea behind the green manures is really to cover the ground with specific plants that you've decided to plant, that are then going to grow and cover the soil. And they will often draw nutrients into their leaves that then when you cut them down, they can be returned to the soil. Those nutrients can be returned to the soil. And it's been practiced for hundreds of years. It's been a long time since, in agricultural terms, that where you're growing a crop, that you would leave a field to go to lay, as it was known. And sometimes you would actually, you might just let the plants emerge naturally, but you also, farmers would often plant specific plants in between as well. So you have plants which you can put in summer and winter. You generally have different plants because obviously there are some plants that grow better in summer and some in winter. So some summer green manures are phacelia, buckwheat, alfalfa, clover, lupins, radish and fenugreek. And then winter green manures, field beans, ryegrass, oatgrass and winter tares. These aren't the only ones, by the way. And I think there are a whole range of plants that have traditionally been used as green manures. I think it's also possible to be a bit more, to also be creative about which green manures you use as well. But generally speaking, you buy seed for these plants in quite large amounts, and then you sow them reasonably thickly. And I was just going to run through a few, just to give you some ideas. So this is phacelia. It grows a mass of green leaves, very succulent, succulent, they're kind of really tender green leaves. They're not edible, but they are fantastic for bees and butterflies. And the idea is that a lot of the nutrients are growing into the leaves. Normally, if you want for those nutrients to be returned to the soil, you would cut the greenery down before it flowers. Personally, I think the flowers are gorgeous, so I usually leave some to flower as well. Buckwheat, another plant that grows a mass of greenery. These both will plant, you could plant them now, for example, if you've got an area of bare soil where you were planning to put in some summer tender crops, the crops you plant in May. So you could plant some green manures now and then cut them down and plant your summer crops through them. Just leave them as a kind of mulch, so you could just chop them up, leave them on top of the soil and plant through them. I mean, there are loads of different ways of doing this. You could also dig them back into the soil. Some people do that. You could also just cut them down and put them on the compost heap and then use the compost on your soil. I mean, it's very flexible. Buckwheat has beautiful flowers as well, lovely for bees as well. So again, you could also leave some for bees and butterflies. Alfalfa has very deep roots. It's a nitrogen fixer, which might fix nitrogen in Italy, but it really needs more sun than we get in Britain. So it's not really a reliable nitrogen fixing plant in Britain, I wouldn't have said. Clover, on the other hand, will fix nitrogen in Britain. So it's a legume. And the leguminous plants, the peas, the beans, the clovers, bird's foot trefoil, lupins, they're all plants that form this particular relationship with bacteria that will then can then change the nitrogen into a form that they can eat, the plants can eat. And I mean, I think one of the ways of growing clover, one of the ways I quite like growing clover, is to grow it as a kind of permanent ground cover, certainly white clover and red clover, and then put your plants through it. So you can just clear an area of clover and put your plants through it, and you don't have to chop the clover down. You can just leave it to grow ongoingly, or you could chop it down and it will regrow, you know. So it's kind of, there are lots of different ways again of growing clover and using clover. Lupins kind of similarly, I mean, they're a bigger plant, but you can see that they look very pea-like. So they're also a good summer green manure. Radish has very deep tap roots, very useful for, or can have deep tap roots, very useful therefore for clay soil, breaking up the clay in the soil. And fenugreek is often used obviously to eat, but is also, you know, it grows a mass of green, which is what you want from a green manure. So basically, yes, you can plant your green manures now, cut them down in early May. You can plant your green manures at any time, to be honest. You know, you could crop, you know, if you have some beans that you've finished cropping, say in August, you could put in some green manures, summer green manures then, that would then last up until October, November in London. You can also plant green manures around your plants. So planting, for example, some lupins or some clover around your corn might be an option, or around a courgette, you know, that would also be great. And you can also mix them together as well and plant a mixture rather than just planting one. Green manures in winter, field beans, which is a kind of leguminous crop. Actually, these are actually eaten in Egypt as ful madam. So you can actually get a crop from field beans. You know, they're delicious, really good. And in fact, what's happened is that somebody noticed this fairly recently, and in Britain they have started selling them, growing them and selling them. So yeah, they're great, but they can also be planted as a green manure, where you grow them, don't let them flower or fruit, and you just cut them down, and they will provide a very good nitrogenous, you know, a boost of nitrogen in the soil. So very useful to plant over winter before you're going to put in plants that require heavy nitrogen, you know, are demanding in terms of nitrogen. This is Hungarian Rye Grass, which I'd shown you we planted at Forest Farm Peace Garden. And this is excellent at basically covering the ground over winter. You get a really good mass of vegetative matter, and you know, and that's really reliable. And you can just either pull it up and lay it on the soil. You could dig it in. You know, there are lots that you can just cut it at the base. You know, so there are lots of different ways to deal with that, and the same with black oats as well. What's great about all of these is they'll germinate in colder weather, and they'll survive without any problems over the winter. This is the also winter terrace. It's a vetch, and so it gives you a good mass of foliage over winter, and it's also a nitrogen fixer as well. So yes, the leaves give the nitrogen. They kind of have absorbed the nitrogen in the leaves, and then when you cut them down, that returns nitrogen to the soil. But it's also with the nitrogen fixers, they also form that relationship with the bacteria as well. So they're particularly effective in giving nitrogen. So again, you can also aim to plant green manures over winter. And again, you could plant a mixture, cut them down. You could dig them in. You could also just leave them as well, so that they're just on the top of the soil as a mulch, which also has added benefits. And you can also leave some to flower, and you could also introduce other plants as well. I mean, you know, chicory, for example, there are lots of beneficial plants which play different roles, you know, so I think you could add chicory, would be an excellent green manure. It's just that normally the seeds are generally quite expensive, so you wouldn't, I think people choose their green manures because they can buy seeds in bulk because you use a lot of seeds, so that kind of somewhat determines it. But there are lots of different you know, the different ones that you can use. So finally, or almost finally, feeding with plant teas. So I particularly wanted to talk about Nettle Tea and Comfrey tea here. So these are not what you would expect. These are not teas that we would drink. Okay, so Nettle Tea for us is one thing. Nettle Tea for plants, totally different thing. And basically, what they involve is taking the plant and putting it in a bucket and kind of fermenting it for a couple of weeks, and it absolutely stinks. But they are fantastic, really, really effective when you're growing vegetables in particular, but also when you're growing anything that's going to where you're trying to get a yield of fruit, where you want to harvest something. And so nettle tea would be particularly beneficial when the plants are growing their leaves. So, for example, if you're growing corn, then you would give a good feed of nettle tea while that green growth is growing. And then once you get to the, where the pollens start, the tassels start to appear, you'd switch to comfrey tea, which is then very good for the flowering and fruiting. The same with tomatoes. You'd feed with nettle tea while it's putting out its initial growth. As soon as you see the flowers start to form, you switch to comfrey tea. Also worth thinking about nettle tea for some of the dye plants, because the key, for example, with woad, the key harvest from woad are the leaves. And so actually when that rosette, while that rosette of leaves is forming in the first year, that's when you'd feed with nettle tea, because those are the leaves you're going to harvest for the dye. You know, once it goes into flowering, you could switch to comfrey because you would also want to have, you know, good solid flowering. You want the seeds and so on, but the nettle will particularly benefit the production of leaves. Okay, so nettle tea, what's useful is you'll already see nettles coming up, and you could early April, well, even now actually, you could go out and gather some nettles and prepare some tea. And this is a picture of the beautiful comfrey. This is just the queen of plants in my view. The number of nutrients that comfrey collects in their leaves is just staggering. And so it's a fantastic plant food because it actually feeds plants a whole heap of nutrients, which, although they're not defined as being essential, are in fact essential for plants. So they've basically, if you go to a plant center and you're looking for plant feed, they'll contain 3 elements. They'll contain nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, which Kat's put into the chat actually, which is, those are the essential nutrients. But actually there are a whole set of nutrients which the plants are also essential, but the plants don't need them in such large amounts. But without them, the plant will, you know, their functions will not work. And so in that sense, comfrey is very beneficial because it has so many different nutrients which are really beneficial. It's also, I mean, I think comfrey is mistaken and believes that she is a tropical plant. And so the way that comfrey tends to grow is as though it is a plant growing in the tropics, which means that there's huge amounts of leafy growth from one plant. And that growth can then be taken and cut down. So this is a permablitz at Cecil Sharp House some time ago. And this is the comfrey leaves being kind of chopped down, torn up and put into, this is a nappy bucket. This is, what's very useful about this is you basically fill it up with the leaves, then cover with water. I often use a brick to just push the leaves under the water, and then you just leave it for a couple of weeks, stirring every now and again, every few days if you can, or every, you know, whenever you remember to. And by the time it's kind of been in for 2 weeks, it smells like, you just can't believe what it smells like. It actually smells a bit like rotting meat. And I know it smells like rotting meat because at Cecil Sharp House, we were feeding the lawn with comfrey, and a fox appeared, convinced that there was rotting meat somewhere around, and was running around completely confused, wondering what was going on because he could smell it, but there wasn't any. And in the end had to make do with a glove that had somehow been soaked in comfrey. Anyway, so I'm saying that because that's hence using a nappy bucket, which then means that not everybody has to be sort of dealing with that, which is a fairly, you know, significant smell. And so then you just strain it out and dilute it sort of 10:1 to create a really effective feed for your plants, which you could feed every couple of weeks for heavy feeders like tomatoes or squash, pumpkins, you know, pretty much anything really. Any of your plants will really benefit from comfrey. And then I was just going to briefly talk about no dig, which is a kind of become a way of approaching growing vegetables, and is essentially about not digging over the soil. And so I think what I've demonstrated is that I don't have an ideological problem with digging over the soil where you've got lots of couch grass, for example, and need to disturb the soil in order to remove the roots or bindweed or brambles or whatever. But the idea is that then you leave the soil after that and ideally don't dig. And every time you do dig, understanding that that's going to disrupt that network of mycelium that exists in the soil. And so your aim is to dig either minimally or not at all overall. And so that's why, generally speaking, I probably wouldn't dig in green manures. I'd just leave them on top. But that's not a hard and fast rule. It does depend on obviously the specific circumstances. So there's any questions, and I can see that there is one already. And that is, oops, get rid of that. And that is, can you grow comfrey and nettles in a large pot? You certainly can, but what you've got to bear in mind is the nutrients in the leaves of the comfrey are probably going to be enhanced by the comfrey being in the soil. And there's a variety of comfrey called Russian Bocking 14. I'll just put that in the, which is a sterile form of comfrey. So in other words, what happens with comfrey does like to grow in family, you know, with a big family. It's like a, you know, sort of, I don't know, a plant with a culture of growing in big families. So you don't usually have one comfrey plant, you have like lots. With most varieties of comfrey. And so basically I think it was Henry Doubleday actually bred a variety of comfrey, which has been bred for the nutrients in the leaves and also for the fact that it doesn't spread. And so what you can do is just allow an area of your garden, you know, like I don't know, a meter square, maybe a bit less, for a comfrey plant. And that will then, you'll just have one. In fact, you could possibly even allow a slightly smaller area, because what you can do once the plant is established is to cut it down about 3 times a year to make your tea. Green manure, 1, can they become invasive? 2, do they compete if left to grow amongst vegetables? I don't know, the green manures can't, I don't think they really become invasive. I think you might find, I mean, clover will spread, I guess. I wouldn't ever have called, you know, the clover invasive. And they will, I guess they could compete if they're left to grow among vegetables, if you leave them to flower and fruit. I think, you know, then they would obviously be competing for nutrients potentially with your vegetables. But what you've got to bear in mind is that if you're growing corn, for example, they need a lot of nitrogen. So having a nitrogen fixing plant around the base of the corn, like clover, would be really beneficial to the corn. So I would still have that, you know, I would still grow corn around the base myself, or beans, or, you know, one of the other nitrogen fixing plants. And I think it's often beneficial to have the ground covered rather than have the ground bare. Yes.
I think I'll speak my question if I can.
Yes, please do.
It's something I was reading about, also soils, that the kind of greenery that grows, including what we consider sometimes weeds, actually tells you about what's either missing or what's too much in the soil. So clover will grow in certain areas and Do you know what I mean? It's like it gives you a message about what's abundant or what's lacking in the soil. But can you naturally otherwise encourage more of one thing, like encourage more clover rather than plant it? There's no way of doing that, I suppose.
Not in my experience, no. I mean, I think that there's a lot of things we don't understand. I mean, there was a situation, there's a place called Knepp in West Sussex where they've left the land to go wild. It's a rewilding project it's called, and basically they've left several thousand acres just to go wild, and they're surrounded by farmers. And one year all these thistles started to grow. So you have a plant, a creeping thistle, which is a nightmare if you're trying to have grazing land or you're trying to grow crops. I mean, more for grazing land actually, because it grows very, very effectively, very fast, and can take over an area. And all the farmers around them were going, you're going to have to get rid of those thistles, that all those seeds are going to come over onto our land, and you know, it's going to destroy our land, and you're not stewarding your land properly. It's all very well going wild, but blah, 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 you know. And they were kind of going, oh, glory be, what do we do? Because we've committed ourselves to rewilding, so we're not intervening. I mean, they were obviously doing some intervening, but generally speaking, they were trying to leave everything just be. And these thistles were just growing massively, you know, into this larger and larger area. And they were thinking, well, maybe we're just going to have to deal with them and, you know, and basically dig them out. And then suddenly they had a summer where there were all these loads and loads of painted lady butterflies came over from the Sahara, which is where they travel from via Spain, arrived in England and basically landed on all these thistles, because that's one of their plants for their caterpillars, laid all these eggs for their caterpillars. And they said within a matter of weeks, the thistles had all been eaten by these caterpillars. And so what was weird was that there's this, you know, this had happened, and then all these painted lady butterflies arrived and ate them. So I think there's a lot more that goes on than we really understand. And you could say, well, that was just chance, and you know, it was lucky, you know, what would have those painted ladies have eaten otherwise? You know, what would their caterpillars have eaten otherwise? They would have gone elsewhere. I don't know. All I'm saying is just, I think you're right, Kat, that things do grow in the soil that, you know, I notice plants that probably like particular areas, and, you know, they're a bit like us. You know, I like living where I live at the moment. I'm, you know, if I had to move to another area, I'd be going, oh, glory be, I've got to get used to being in South London. I used to live in South London, but now the idea of living in Southeast London fills me with like, oh, glory be, really? And it's partly because you know, I don't know. I'm being very scientific here. I don't know if I have an answer. Does anyone else have an answer to that? It certainly is the case that there are different plants that play different roles. That's what I was going to say. So, for example, dock, you know, has a very deep taproot, brings up minerals from within the soil, as does, you know, as do a whole heap of other plants. They all bring up different minerals. So, yeah, I think that's true. And I also think that you'll usually find quite a diversity of plants as well. So, yeah. Not sure if I've answered that or not.
There's a question there about smell and the tea that smells.
I think it's basically because they are, the process of fermenting the comfrey and nettle is anaerobic. So it uses, because it's in water, it's therefore there's no oxygen involved. So it's a bit like when you have, if you have compost that is too wet, it gets really smelly. And again, it's because of the anaerobic process. So, yeah.
I have some nettle tea from last year. Do you think do you think it goes off, or do you think I can still maybe use it this coming year?
I would still use it, I think. I mean, I haven't heard of it going off, but having said that, I haven't checked, but I think I can't see any reason particularly why it should.
Yeah.
Making and using leaf molds. that's a fantastic thing. That's why I can tell this workshop could probably go on for about 2 hours, 3 hours, all day. It could go on all day actually, very easily, because there's so much to it. And leaf mold is obviously one of my favorite things to make, and I think it's really fantastic stuff. And part of the reason why is because it's a compost that's predominantly fungally based, and that's because it requires the fungus to break down the leaves, and so it means that it's a long process. It takes a long time to compost leaves, and I think it's what's fantastic about it is that there are loads of leaves available in general, and the main thing that you need is some space, and then it's just fantastic. You can just leave them basically, turn them a couple of times, you know, turn the compost a couple of times, make sure it stays wet enough, and what you should have coming out is a fantastic compost that's alive. So because it's such a, you know, it develops over such a long period, it really develops a kind of really good soil food web in the compost. So as opposed to if you're doing a hot compost, which is much more bacterially based, so that with a hot compost, the bacteria eat, you know, and compost down the contents. And so that discourages so much of the soil food web because it heats up. You know, so if you're doing a hot compost, it gets up to kind of 60 degrees, it can get up to, and that will kill the fungus and, you know, loads of the other creatures. Not tardigrades, obviously, to have plenty of tardigrades still there. But a lot of the other creatures will die. It's not to say they don't come back, you know, they'll reappear, but you're then putting on a bacterially dominated compost onto your soil.
How long does it normally take for the leaves to break down and be usable as a surface mulch generally?
So it really depends on the leaves. So if you've got leaves like hornbeam or fruit tree leaves like apple trees or pear tree, you know, those kind of leaves, where they're quite, or silver birch, for example, where they're quite thin, then that'll probably take a year.
See, the ones that come from my fruit tree, even the fig tree leaves I put into, I have a Dalek compost pile, and they break down relatively quickly with food waste.
Yeah.
The mature trees, because I'm next to a park, we have it's mainly sycamore plane and a horse chestnut. So
Right.
I've had, the first time I tried it, I put it into black bags in the corner of the garden.
Yeah.
And all that happened was the roots, it was next to a mature ivy, and the ivy's roots just grew into it.
Right.
So, but the leaves didn't break down very much. And now I put them in the bags that normally the green garden waste is collected, but they don't collect from me anymore.
Right.
So I put them in there and I keep them moist and I turn them. But when I went to use it, I incorporated it into an area that had a structure on it. So the soil was very compacted and dead. So I dug it over and I dug it in, but it seemed to dry out very quickly. Like, I'm not sure if it was fully decomposted, to be honest. So I was wondering, and that was there for about 2 years. So I'm not sure if that's long enough, or do I need to have a system where it's like a 5-year plan?
Well, plane tree leaves, I mean, I don't think I've done much with horse chestnut, but I think sycamore, plane tree leaves in particular, I mean, I've got some that I've been composting for 2 years now, and they are starting to break down, but they're not, you know, they've still got probably at least another year to go. And I think that there are 2 things that I would do to speed the process up. The first is with plane tree leaves in particular, they've got to be wet, and they also need to be turned, because what happens is they kind of sandwich themselves together, and so then it's very hard to get for the air to get in and the moisture to get in, and they kind of become sort of like leaves of a book, if you know what I mean, in my experience. So then the composting process, it can't penetrate as easily. It's like they become thick. So I mean, one thing you can do is certainly which will speed it up, is to chop them up in some way, to I don't know, mow them, I mean, that's something I sometimes do, but that's quite a lot of work if you've got loads
I
of...
don't have a mower, don't have
No,
any lawn.
no. But then the other thing is to put in nitrogenous material. So put in something very green. So, you know, if you can get grass clippings or maybe coffee grounds, you could try. You
I
know,
generate a lot of coffee.
Yeah, but you can also get coffee grounds from coffee shops as well.
Okay, that's a great idea.
And you could try mixing those in. I think that, and also urine as well. That's another really underutilized fertilizer, in my view. So if you collect your urine and mix that in, that has a really good effect as well. It'll, you know, you'll often find that then you'll start to get a hot compost. That's what I've found when I've mixed urine in with leaves, but it does speed the process up. And you can always do that, get the process going, and then leave it for, you know, a few months to kind of finish the process.
I do have loads of worms in the
Right.
with the leaves.
Yeah, well, that's good. I mean, it's probably just what you're doing sounds like it's probably fine. It's just that it takes a long time. It does take a long time.
But how do you know when it's actually ready?
It really does crumble down so that you can't see any bits of leaf.
Okay, I should have waited a little longer, I think.
Well, I mean, yeah, having said that, then there's no harm in putting that into the soil. That just provides more food for the creatures. So, I mean, that's good as well. It's not, I think it's more that, I think one thing I would say about water is that we think we live in, because we're living in England, and there's this thing about England having loads of rain. A lot of England does have a lot of rain, but in London, we have less rain than Tunis in Tunisia. Okay, so it is essentially in England, in London, it's like being in the Mediterranean in terms of the amount of rain we have over the summer at any rate. So I think that's worth bearing in mind, is that it's really easy to underestimate how much water our gardens need, or how much we're going to have to, by mulching, obviously you're also mulching the water in, which is really beneficial, but it is, things dry out a lot. Okay, Eleanor's had to leave. I'm just going to answer one final question, which is about the London soils, which are all clay. I don't think you'll find, I think you'll find there are a few strips of gravel, but on the whole, they're clay. But what you do find is that a lot of back gardens or front gardens have had the rubble from the building works incorporated into the soil. And so what can happen, particularly more recently, I think, is that builders put the rubble into the soil and then cover with a layer of topsoil. So they'll actually ship in some topsoil and put that on top, or having removed some topsoil, they put it back. So you dig down, and before you know where you are, you've got a whole load of rubble. Okay, so just worth bearing that in mind. It's not necessarily a major problem, but it is worth knowing whether or not that's there, and therefore potentially building up your soil on top.
I would also say that generally you think it's quite rich as the soil goes. If it is clay and not rubble, I think in my experience, it's quite good to grow most things on the whole.
Excellent, very
Apart
good.
from going really hard in the summer and really sticky when it's wet.
It's a total nightmare if you're actually trying to garden with like growing vegetables and you're trying to dig the soil over and all that kind of thing. Yeah, and it's like, you know, it can be the bane of your life. If you're trying to get couch grass out of clay soil, that's the kind of torture that you would want to give someone to do, really, in my view. But having said that, it's fantastic. It's full of nutrients. It's full of nutrients, which, remember, the plants are going to need the creatures in the soil in order to access those. But yeah, I mean, you know, it's fantastic soil in many other ways. So then a lot of the things that I've been talking about what you can do in terms of mulching, green manures and so on, those are all things which over time will start to aerate the soil more, you know, so that then the clay soil, which the problem with it is it tends to become compacted because there isn't that space in between the sort of bits of soil, you know, it's too dense. That can actually start to break, you know, become more aerated through using green manures, through mulching and so on. So you kind of just, it's just about encouraging the creatures in the soil, I would say. Okay, I feel like I've just yacked at you. I've got no idea whether or not that's actually been useful and interesting. I'm really hoping it has. And I'm really hoping as well that this isn't, you know, the last. It'd be really good to hear how you get on, and, you know, and for us to share a lot more, and also to carry on learning from each other as well, because everybody's got different experiences, different things they've tried out, and everyone has their own way of doing things as well, which is really, I always love learning about other people's techniques and approaches and all the rest of it. So I'm really hoping that we'll be able to share that in the future. I would also just like to ask you, I'm going to send out an email with a feedback form, and we have to, this workshop is free because we have funding to cover my time. And so it would be really brilliant to have your feedback on the workshop, because I can then give that back to the funders. You know, they like to hear what the feedback's been like, and that means that, you know, that will facilitate the ongoing funding. It's also just really useful as well, because it's really good to have your feedback. So it's just a quick online form. I'll just send it out with a link, and yeah, it'd be brilliant to hear what you have to say, if you'd be willing to do that. So yeah, I feel like I don't really want to finish, but I think we have to. I'd said this was going to be from 7 till 8. I knew I was totally unrealistic, so I'm really sorry that it's gone over, but it's been really nice seeing everyone. And hopefully next week we're doing a session on pollinators and growing for pollinators. So growing for sort of the insects really, and how to best go about, you know, supporting the bees and butterflies and other pollinating creatures. Okay, so that's the same time next week, but I'll send out the details of that in the email as well, in case you'd like to join us for that. So thank you very much for coming, and hopefully I'll see you next week, or some of you on Saturday, or some of you at some point soon.
Yeah, I see you today, Susan. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. See you. Thank you. See
Bye.
You. Bye.
Just
Bye.
wondered, where are you storing the recording?
It's going to be on YouTube.
Okay.
Okay, and I don't think I'll have the link for it when I send out the email, but I will do I'll ask you if you want to become part of the mailing list, and then you'll be able to